My name is Sandi Mero, and I work in the Advancement and Alumni Office here at KGI. As such, one of my roles is to engage with alumni through the Office of Alumni Support. Today on the podcast, I am thrilled to be chatting with Brian Feth, who is the CEO at Xcell Biosciences. He is a life sciences entrepreneur passionate about creating transformative change in human health through powerful new technologies to better understand and destroy cancer. Thank you for joining us today, Brian. How did you first become interested in coming to KGI?
Had been doing some research in different academic labs through the course of undergrad. Ultimately decided I did not want to get a PhD, but I did enjoy the process of research. I enjoyed the detail and the kind of, I would say that I had a passion for the problem solving that was a core part of research, but didn't like the narrowness of focus that ultimately resulted from a career in research. Wanted something that had a broader view of the applications of the research. And so I knew I wanted to do something in business where you had access or a view into a portfolio of different activities within a research space. And I knew I wanted to do that within the biotech world, but I wasn't really sure how to transition to that. And most of the placement statistics out of an undergrad program in biology or in chemistry are, either into a PhD program or into a research associate position, which I'm sure many of our alumni started out in before they came to KGI. So knowing in advance that was not necessarily the path I wanted to take, and that I felt like that time would be better spent kind of picking up a tool set that was more aligned with a career in business, I was looking for programs that would provide a background in business, the business toolkit, but would be life science focused. And there was just really a dearth of that, particularly back in 2003 when I was looking for programs and I was graduating from Purdue University. And at the time, there was maybe just a handful of programs that were even talking about the idea of a biotechnology industry-based graduate master's. And those programs only had a few years of experience at most to look at placement statistics. And so you could look at the curriculum, you could look at where those students had gone. And unfortunately, despite branding a lot of those programs, we're still sending students back into research technician types of roles afterwards, which really didn't meet the goal for me of the program. And I would say KGI was really distinct and unique in that the placements out of the program were in a range of different business areas within the biotech pharmaceutical space. That the types of companies that they were landing in, I thought were very interesting, and really a diversity of them, and that the curriculum itself, at least at the time, was really maybe 2/3 technical coursework, of which there was, I would say, a split of bioengineering, bioinformatics, and molecular biology, and then kind of a third of business programming that was all kind of focused on the life sciences space. And that's really different than what other programs were offering. And even at the time, there was some MBA programs that were talking about focus in biotechnology, but they really didn't offer case studies or coursework that was kind of related to the pharmaceutical industry in any depth. And as we all know, that industry operates very differently as a function of who makes the purchasing decision, who ultimately is the recipient of the care, and the cost and timeline for developing a drug, all of the technical nuance involved in kind of developing products in that space. It's really just a very unique industry, and I think demanded a very unique educational perspective to be able to train leadership in that area and do it well. And so it stood out, and I was accepted in all the grad programs that I looked at. Many of which were Ivy League, and had quite good branding, but the curriculum and the data didn't support that these would be as beneficial to my career as KGI would have been. So I made the choice to go with, at the time, what was a relatively no name, unknown school, but I felt would educate me in a way that would allow me to be successful in my career more so than a better branded or well known school would be.
Right. Well, we obviously are glad you chose KGI. And so during the time you spent at KGI, what course had the biggest impact, would you say?
Yeah, this is, they were all actually pretty impactful. I used particularly directly out, and I still think on a regular basis, elements of most of the coursework, organizational leadership, understanding the difference between a kind of what a matrix style organization was something that I remember learning at the time and kind of finding that unique and new. Bioethics and kind of the all of the background in, I think, human failure that ultimately led us to kind of be able to talk about these use cases within the biotechnology field and be able to learn from them. I thought was really interesting, to learn from the past and to kind of use that as an exercise to think about how to be an ethical leader. There was certainly a range of different bioengineering coursework and bioinformatics coursework that, particularly bioinformatics has changed dramatically since I was in school and really evolved in a lot of ways. But the elements of what is being done, how it's being done, all of those, I think, have continued to live with me and are the foundational principles of how I work in those fields and relate to the people that are doing that work. The coursework that really ultimately was the one that I think had the most influence was an independent study I did with Hank Riggs, who was a professor at the time, and it was my second year. He retired as president at the end of my first year, and was still teaching the intro accounting class, accounting and finance, and I engaged him for an independent study on corporate valuations. And that was partly driven by the fact that I thought maybe a good career option for me would be either in corporate planning or in management consulting. And I wanted to be able to model revenue growth in companies, be able to create a net present value around a company, be able to do broader market models, and that's a very unique aspect of finance, the field of finance, but one that's a very applied and useful one, and particularly in a career in strategy. I asked Hank; he was thrilled to do it, and we kind of learned and went through it together. And we recruited a couple other students into it, and so we had probably a small class of 4. Along with Hank, we met on a weekly basis in a conference room or at a coffee shop, and I had a lot of fun doing it. And it was a textbook worth reading and then worth having a discussion with Hank about. And in fact, some of those have stuck with me. Not only do I still do a lot of financial modeling in my work, but some of the folks that we interacted with at the time are still present in my life and have been really important for my company's growth. So one of the things we did was build a financial model around a relatively small but growing startup called Illumina. And we drove down, and being in LA, it was easy access to get down there. We drove down and met with Jay Flatley and as well as his CFO at the time, and spent an hour with them walking through the model we developed and talking to Jay and his CFO about how they think about valuing the corporation and what it means, what things they do differently as a function of having to report to the market, public markets, about what they're doing. And that was kind of juxtaposed to a meeting that we had with a financial analyst at SG Cowen that was tracking this company in the public markets and doing his own model on performance of the company and forecasting revenues in the future. And I believe we met with one other group that it was a different types of research analyst that kind of, again, thinks about markets in a different way. And we were able to see how different perspectives, different elements that are important to those different parties informed how they go about the process of forecasting. And I thought that was ultimately very useful. And I see Jay frequently. Ultimately, our company went through an Illumina accelerator, we have kind of that shared experience. He remembered it years later, and
great.
And still, spoke very highly of Hank, who was actually his professor at Stanford whenever he was going through business school.
Would you say, out of all the KGI faculty members, I know as far as a key mentor for you, would that have been Hank Riggs, or is there other faculty members that you can recall that had a really important place here and for you in your career?
Yeah, I mean, Hank was certainly I would say the most influential, but my I believe it was my first year, was also Steve Casper's first year. And I remember talking with him about why KGI was unique, and feeling very aligned in my choice, and very similar to why Steve had chosen the program. He came from Cambridge. There was a competing program they were starting there that we kind of both felt, again, that there was more focus on optical branding than on curriculum, and that KGI really kind of stuck out in terms of investing in the program, a type of program that would ultimately lead to successful leaders and in the life sciences. And his classes on strategy, I thought were very interesting. Obviously, it was aligned with my own interests as well. And so he's a guy that I met with regularly. I think he was also our TMP leader or mentor. And so I spent a good amount of time with Steve while I was in school.
What skills would you say you gained at KGI that you still use most frequently in your role today?
It's a tough thing, because it's from a strong foundation, leads to a lot of different places. I think I can tell you immediately I felt empowered going into consulting. I was interviewed with and was, I think, the first KGI alumnus at LEK Consulting. And when I started, I remember feeling that I had a much better foundation than the PhDs that were coming in out of graduate programs. And that was interestingly both from a knowledge of kind of the range of business activities that we're engaged in as consultants, from competitive analysis to market modeling, financial forecasting, but also from a technical perspective, which was a surprise to me. A PhD coming in with a combinatorial chemistry background doesn't necessarily have an understanding of what the difference is between a polyclonal and monoclonal antibody. And, for my first case, that was a topic of discussion, and a key focus for the client that we were working with. And, having that base to build from, I thought was a very useful thing, and much more useful than, I would say, a training of problem solving from a PhD perspective would have had in the same field. So it was which is exactly why I chose to come to KGI versus go get a PhD. It was a different way of thinking and a different industry framework to think from.
Right.
And I think from my daily use now, it's still very similar to that, and that I have a very broad background, from the engineering aspects to informatics aspects to the range of processes that take place, from target discovery to validation to lead selection, characterization, optimization. All of those things were kind of foundational principles about why and how you do those things that I learned at KGI that ultimately I use on a daily basis.
How has a failure or apparent failure set you up for later success? Like, do you have a favorite failure of yours?
I do. I think so. When you start a career, you are working from a place of kind of very little information about often company culture, the team that you'll be working with, and even the industry space that you're entering, especially straight out of graduate school. It's hard to know whether you'll like what you're entered into or not. And I think for me, I learned early on that I really enjoyed the process of management consulting, that I really enjoyed the field of strategy, and that I really liked working with leadership at these biotech and pharmaceutical companies to think about where the market opportunities were, how to think about how to capture those opportunities within their business. And but ultimately, kind of management consulting requires a certain type of individual and a certain kind of investment that to do that as a career. And I remember at the time, most people don't stay in management consulting; they move on and do other things, and often go work with the clients that they've been working with. But that transition often feels a little bit like a failure, that you're moving from something that you've learned that you don't like, which I think is a healthy, normal thing. And in hindsight, a very natural thing to say, I don't really enjoy this anymore. I need to go do something else. And this is what I've learned from that experience. But at the time you feel that you're quitting, or that this is something that, ultimately is, I can't, I don't want to do or can't do as well as somebody that's been there for 20 years. And I think, that for me over time has been a process of a maturity and kind of thinking about the things I'm really good at and that I like to do, and focusing my time and energy in that, and in trying to avoid businesses and things that maybe have a culture that's not aligned with my own philosophy and the culture that I'd like to be part of, and not viewing that as some shortcoming of my own, but as a something that I think is a definition of a good self-understanding. And so, when I started the business that I'm running now, it was a great opportunity to create a culture and an environment that was something that I felt it represented me, and offered me the opportunity to bring in employees that kind of reflected those values. And so I think it's been a real kind of a really beautiful thing to be able to create something and to do it in kind of your own image in some ways, to be able to build an organization that you enjoy being at, and that the managers that you're working with and the leaders that you've developed are kind of similarly minded.
Oh, that makes complete sense. I like that. What advice would you give to a smart, driven graduate student about to enter an industry?
Yeah, I think, one of the things I found helpful, one of the reasons that I wanted to go to KGI was that I didn't have enough information, enough data to be able to know how I wanted to develop and build my career. What I did know was that the thing that was kind of the logical conclusion of an undergraduate degree in my field was not what I wanted to do. And so KGI kind of offered me an opportunity to build some new skill sets, but really educate myself on what opportunities were available and how I wanted to kind of build and invest in myself to ultimately define a career. And I don't think that process is fully finished by the time you graduate. And so really the early part of your career is about field testing what you've learned to determine exactly where in that space you want to be. And, I would say I bought that field testing some time by going into management consulting, where you're seeing a lot of different businesses and a lot of different industries. And even within the life sciences, from, I spent time working on projects that were research tools oriented to pharmaceutical development to medical device. And I think that allows you a platform to really see various areas of an organization and various functions within an organization. And I think that process is important, and you can do that at a large organization in a rotational program. You can do it in consulting, which I kind of think of in some ways as boot camp. You do it in a very kind of rigorous, intense way, but you get a huge amount of information in a short period of time. And I think if you're financially oriented, an investment bank can be a very similar experience. And I like those types of programs. And I know, business schools and likely KGI is interacting with companies in a form that wants to be able to invest and train those employees in the kind of the culture and the functional expertise that organization is skilled at. And so I think there's a lot of benefit to joining an organization and a function that has some diversity of functional experience to be able to build that skill set out and kind of continue to search. One of the things I saw early in my career was that even in consulting, there were a lot of folks that had gone into consulting because they felt it was a defined path to some outcome. They do 2 years of consulting or 3 years of consulting, then you go on and do a year or two of investment banking, go get your MBA. There was kind of this path that people felt like was a part of how you define your career to be to get to some form of an ideal that everybody had been thinking about. And the truth is, I don't think that way at all. I think, you're in the world and you go to get your education because it's exactly what you want. You want an education. You want to be able to search for things that interest you and pursue those interests. And ultimately, when you find the things that you're very interested in, you'll generally be very good at them. And so I think it's kind of a myth that there's some sort of set path. So, I would encourage the students to take classes that they enjoy and that they look for companies that they think are interesting, and that those things will lead to places that they didn't expect. And rather than try to pursue some ideal of what they think they should be doing.
How about what advice should they ignore?
I actually, so one of the things I learned, and I'm not sure I learned it at KGI, but there's definitely a strong statistical kind of, I don't know if it's more of a correlation, it may be causable, but there's certainly alignment between their starting salary and your ultimate salary later in life. And that, there's a lot of data to show that negotiating a package well early on influences every package you get after that in a pretty important way. So something that maybe is talked about, I'm not sure there's advice to not negotiate a package, but it just may not be discussed as much. I think coming out of a graduate program, you kind of feel like you're in the short end of the negotiating stick, and that may be true, but there's always room to negotiate a bit. And so I think kind of, even in my work today, and I'm interviewing people all the time and hiring people, I'm always surprised that some people negotiate vigorously, maybe too much. Other people don't negotiate at all. And I think it's just, you should always do a bit. There is a limit. I think there's one volley back and forth, and if you go beyond that, you can kind of sour the relationship. But I would encourage people to do that, and rather than take what they get. And beyond negotiating, I also think that that's true for internships. I took internships late and benefited a lot as a result of that. There's a lot of people that are just in a hurry to lock it up and be done with the process, which I completely understand. But there's taking your time and maybe dealing with a bit of risk as a function of that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I've found that that's been a very useful thing for me coming out of school.
I wanted to go back and ask you to share a little more about Xcell Biosciences and your company. We'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah. We formed around my co-founder's technical skill set of being able to keep human cells alive in culture. And that's not an easy thing to do. There's a huge amount of research built on cell lines and proxies for human disease. And that's been over decades now of research, preclinical research and academic research. And that's largely as a function of human tissues are really tough to keep alive outside the body. And so when we kind of talked about the concept for starting this business, it was really around a couple of tips and tricks that my co-founder developed to coax cells into being happy in culture. And when we started the company, we tried to think about what application this would be most powerful for, where the margin of benefit would be the biggest. And at the time, this was 5, maybe almost 6 years ago, the field of circulating tumor cells was very hot, which are these kind of seeds that are shot off of a primary tumor and circulate in the blood and ultimately plant new tumors elsewhere. And some do and some don't. I think for us, it was creating a system where we tricked those cells into thinking that they were at home and kind of creating the right soil for them to plant in. And that gave us information both from a functional standpoint: how fast do they form colonies? Do they grow? How fast are they growing? What markers do they have? And then from a genetic standpoint, how are these different clones different from each other? And what that might imply about a treatment that a patient should get. And so the first half of our corporate life was focused on this idea of these cells as well as immune cells that we were able to grow, and using them as a kind of very rich data source for diagnostics. And ultimately, we decided through a number of different factors that there was just not a lot of market appetite for a long process or an expensive process to generate data out of vials of blood, out of this kind of liquid biopsy. That the liquid biopsy market had really evolved in a way that people wanted a rapid, low-cost assay that could survey for kind of hypothesis-driven markers. You know what you're looking for, you survey for it, it's there or not. What we were doing was really a kind of a new discovery tool for identifying signatures of a disease and trying to understand kind of changes in clonal populations over time. And so given kind of, we loved the technology, felt it was very powerful, but didn't feel like the market we had chosen was ready for that type of technology or would be willing to pay for that type of technology in a clinical setting. And what we were seeing was that we were getting interest from pharmaceutical companies to grow solid tumors from biopsies, to grow their immune cell populations, to try to enrich challenging subtypes that were interesting and useful therapeutically. And so we pivoted. We reframed the company as a technology platform, formatted that technology to be something that we could sell commercially, and raised a reasonably large Series A for our company, for the type of business we were building, to go out and build a product set around this capability. And so as we've gone, as you do, we've kind of further focused and went from kind of this broad capability of keeping tumors alive and expanding a culture to kind of expanding different types of immune cell populations and using the environment to influence phenotype of those immune cells and activity of those immune cells, and even seeing capability of driving differentiation very quickly in stem cell populations, and tried to tie some themes around that so we could be more focused as a company and create a lead pipeline for the sales that would be not stretch the team mentally, and also create a product pipeline that was kind of thematic and was able to kind of more and more target the population that we wanted to go after. So we focused the business on immuno-oncology, immunotherapy specifically, and even further than that, identified that the area of greatest need in culturing human cells is in this new kind of evolving area of cell therapy, where the immune cell itself is the therapeutic. It's taken out of a patient, it's modified, and then put back into a patient with a payload so that it becomes a heat-seeking missile to go after the tumors. And it's a very exciting field. It's when it works, it can be curative, and it's an area that's brand new. The first 2 commercial products were launched at the end of 2017. I'm sure the program discusses this area quite a bit, particularly given a large focus now on bioprocessing. And we also identified that bioprocessing and the ability to enrich these cells and expand them in ways that would maintain the quality was a really big unmet need. And that was something that we were naturally very good at, was controlling the quality, the performance of cells. And so we've moved the company towards cell therapy, both from a development standpoint, creating a translational tool set to allow you to interact and measure the performance of these cells in vitro. And then are building manufacturing technologies with the same technology to be able to lock those benefits you get from a defined environment to be able to manufacture those cells with that same performance that you see in a translational setting. So our company's now kind of shifted from, all the way from diagnostics now into cell therapy manufacturing.
Wow, that's exciting. Brian, I just wanted to thank you for being on the podcast today and sharing all of your information about your time at KGI and also about your company, Xcell Biosciences.